It is a few minutes past 11 on the night of June 5, 1944, and in a modest farmhouse outside the Normandy village of Isigny, a woman kneels beside a wireless set with the volume turned down to almost nothing. Her ear is pressed close to the fabric-covered speaker. Rain patters against the shutters. Somewhere in the dark countryside beyond her window, a German patrol is walking a road she cannot see, boots crunching gravel in a rhythm she has learned to recognize without looking. She is listening for a sentence. Not a code, not a number, but an ordinary-sounding line of French poetry, broadcast between innocuous messages on the BBC's French service. She has heard the first half of it already, days ago, tucked among dozens of similar phrases meant to confuse anyone listening who should not be. Now she needs the second half because the second half means the invasion is coming within hours, and that she and thousands like her across occupied France must, before the sun rises, begin quietly destroying their own country's railways, bridges, and telephone lines. The line comes. She writes nothing down. She simply stands, extinguishes the lamp, and walks out into the rain to wake her husband, who keeps a crate of gelignite buried beneath the pig shed. This is not a story about the soldiers who waded ashore at dawn on the beaches with names like Gold, Juno, and Omaha, though their courage is beyond dispute and has been told 1,000 times. This is the story of what happened in the dark before that, away from the cameras and the official war artists, carried out by shopkeepers, farmers, school teachers, and railwaymen who had no uniforms, no rank, and, very often, no real training, and who nonetheless managed to help paralyze an army. It matters because the Allied planners who drew up the invasion knew something uncomfortable, that no matter how many men landed on the beaches, the operation could still fail if the Germans moved their reserves fast enough to throw the invaders back into the sea. The men and women of the French resistance were tasked, in the space of a single night, with making that impossible. The problem facing the Allies in the spring of 1944 was not simply how to get soldiers onto the Normandy coast. Getting men ashore was, in a grim sense, the easier half of the equation. The harder half was keeping them there. Military planners at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force understood, from bitter experience in Italy and North Africa, that the first 72 hours after any landing were the most dangerous, because that was the window in which a well-organized defender could rush armored divisions to the point of attack and crush the beachhead before it had a chance to grow roots. Germany had, by 1944, more than 50 divisions stationed in France, including powerful armored formations held in reserve specifically for this purpose. The Panzer Lehr Division, the 12th SS Panzer Division, and others were positioned within striking distance of the Normandy coast, and German doctrine called for them to move at speed the moment an invasion was confirmed. France's railway network in 1944 was, on paper, superb for exactly this kind of rapid reinforcement. It had been built and expanded over nearly a century into one of the densest systems in Europe, with major junctions threading through towns such as Caen, Rennes, and Saumur that would allow German reserves to converge on Normandy from Brittany, from the Loire, and from the Pas-de-Calais within a day or two of the alarm being raised. If those trains ran on schedule, Allied planners feared, the beachhead might be reinforced against, encircled and destroyed before enough men and armor could be landed to hold it. Allied bomber squadrons had already spent months attacking rail yards and bridges in a campaign that cost thousands of French civilian lives and drew sharp criticism at the time. Yet bombing alone could not guarantee the paralysis that was needed, because rail lines could often be repaired within days by determined engineering crews. What was required was something that conventional air power struggled to deliver: precise, simultaneous, small-scale destruction at thousands of specific points across the country, carried out at the exact moment it would do the most damage and not a day before, so that German repair crews would have no advance warning and no opportunity to stockpile replacement parts. This was not a job for bombers, it was a job for people already living beside the tracks. The organization that made this possible had been built, painstakingly and at enormous personal risk over the preceding 4 years by the Special Operations Executive, working from its offices in Baker Street, London, in close coordination with General de Gaulle's Free French Intelligence Service, the Bureau Central de Renseignement et d'Action. Together, they had parachuted agents, wireless, operators, and weapons into France since 1941, gradually knitting together disparate resistance cells, some communist, some Gaullist, some simply patriotic and apolitical, into networks capable of coordinated action. By the spring of 1944, planners in London had drawn up an extraordinarily detailed document known as the Plan Vert, targeting railways, alongside companion plans codenamed Plan Bleu for electrical power stations, Plan Violet for telephone and telegraph cables, and Plan Tortue, aimed specifically at delaying road-bound reinforcements by felling trees, mining verges, and blocking narrow lanes. Each plan assigned specific targets to specific resistance groups in specific regions, all timed to activate only upon the transmission of prearranged BBC messages, the famous personal messages broadcast alongside greetings and coded phrases that sounded, to any German listening in, like meaningless nonsense. The tools available to resistance saboteurs were often improvised, but the techniques they employed had been refined by SOE instructors into something approaching an art form. Plastic explosive, principally a substance the British called 808, arrived by parachute in small waxy blocks that could be molded by hand like modeling clay and molded around a rail joint or a signal box relay with almost no specialist training. A charge weighing little more than a bag of sugar, perhaps half a kilogram, packed against the web of a rail at precisely the right point, could sever it as cleanly as a bolt cutter through wire, and the sound of the detonation in open countryside carried little further than a car backfiring, easily lost beneath the noise of wind and rain. Saboteurs learned to attack not just the rails themselves, but the points, the signaling relays, and above all the water towers that supplied steam locomotives, because a locomotive without water was as useless as one without rails, and a destroyed water tower took far longer to rebuild than a length of track. Others used a simpler, near-silent method borrowed from railway workers themselves, loosening fish plates, the steel bars bolting rail sections together, so that a train traveling at speed would derail through nothing more dramatic than gravity and momentum, leaving behind an accident scene that gave away little evidence of deliberate interference. The explosives themselves were manufactured in Britain, principally in facilities linked to the Royal Ordnance Network and distributed through SOE's supply chain, before being packed into containers designed to survive a parachute drop from aircraft such as the Westland Lysander and the four-engined Handley Page Halifax, flown by squadrons that specialized in these clandestine night flights into fields marked out by resistance members holding torches in prearranged patterns. When the coded messages finally came on the night of 5th and 6th June, they triggered what remains one of the most extensive coordinated sabotage campaigns of the entire war. Across Brittany, in the Loire Valley, through the Massif Central and into the region immediately behind the invasion beaches, resistance groups struck simultaneously. In Brittany alone, cells linked to networks around Rennes cut rail lines at more than 500 separate points within the space of a single night, according to post-war SOE assessments, though exact figures remain difficult to verify given the destruction of many contemporary records. Around Toulouse, saboteurs attacked the rail lines that would have carried the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, north towards Normandy from its base near Montauban, forcing the division into an agonizingly slow overland march that took nearly 2 weeks to complete a journey that should have taken days, a delay compounded by ambushes, blown bridges, and skirmishes with Maquis fighters along its route. German logistics officers, accustomed to a railway system that had functioned with ruthless efficiency, found themselves confronting hundreds of breaks simultaneously, with repair crews stretched impossibly thin and unable to determine which lines were genuinely critical and which were decoys. Telephone exchanges across Normandy and Brittany fell silent within hours as resistance groups cut cables according to Plan Violet, forcing German commanders back onto radio networks that Allied signals intelligence, thanks to the code breakers at Bletchley Park, could intercept and read. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is plenty more of this story still to come. The Germans were not without their own irregular forces attempting similar disruption in reverse, though nothing on the Allied side matched the scale or coordination achieved in Normandy. German efforts to organize stay-behind sabotage networks in territories they expected to lose later in the war never approached the depth of local knowledge and civilian support that French resistance groups could draw upon because the French networks had spent years building trust with railway workers, postal staff, and ordinary villagers who might tip off a group about troop movements or repair schedules. American planners, watching the French model, drew heavily upon it when organizing Operation Jedburgh. Three-man teams of British, American, and French personnel parachuted in uniform behind the lines to coordinate resistance activity directly, blending SOE's clandestine experience with a more overtly military structure. The comparison that mattered most, though, was raw effect. German staff assessments captured after the war acknowledged that reinforcement schedules for Normandy were disrupted by days rather than hours in several key instances, a delay that mattered enormously in a battle where the Allied beachhead spent its first week clinging to territory only a few miles deep. No single other resistance movement in occupied Europe, not in Poland, not in Yugoslavia, not even in Italy, managed to coordinate an act of sabotage so precisely timed to a single military operation on this scale, because nowhere else had the parallel structure of BBC-coded broadcasts, SOE liaison officers, and pre-planned target lists been developed to quite the same degree of refinement. Assessing the precise impact of this campaign remains, even 80 years later, an exercise in careful qualification rather than confident certainty. Historians broadly agree that the delays imposed on German reinforcements, particularly on armored divisions moving from the south and from Brittany, bought the Allies precious additional time to consolidate their beachhead during the most vulnerable early days of the invasion, though estimates of exactly how many hours or days were added to any specific division's march vary between sources and were, in some cases, exaggerated for propaganda purposes both during and after the war. What is not in dispute is the psychological toll. German officers' post-war accounts describe a growing unease at operating in territory that seemed, almost overnight, to have turned hostile in every direction, where a telephone call might not connect, a train might not arrive, and a quiet country lane might conceal an ambush. This atmosphere of pervasive uncertainty arguably achieved something bombing alone never could, forcing German commanders to divert soldiers away from the front to guard railways and escort convoys, soldiers who were consequently unavailable to reinforce the beaches. The techniques pioneered by SOE and its French partners, particularly the close coordination between coded broadcast, prepositioned explosives, and locally recruited saboteurs, would go on to influence irregular warfare doctrine for decades afterward, studied by military academies long after the guns of Normandy fell silent. Surviving relics of that night can still be found today. Sections of rail twisted by half-kilogram charges are preserved in regional museums across Brittany and Normandy, and the farmhouse cellars and barns that once hid crates of explosives now, in some cases, bear small plaques commemorating the families who risked everything to store them. Return for a moment to that woman in the farmhouse near Isigny, standing in the rain at midnight with a coded phrase ringing in her memory. She was not a soldier. She had received no medal parade, no official commendation in the years immediately following the war, and her name, like so many others, exists today mostly in local records and family recollection, rather than in grand histories. Yet what she and tens of thousands like her achieved in a single night was, in its own quiet way, as decisive as anything that happened on the beaches at dawn. Soldiers landing at Gold, Juneau, and Omaha needed time above all else. Time to dig in, time to bring ashore tanks and artillery and reinforcements, time before the German counterattack could gather its full strength. That time was bought not by aircraft or battleships, but by ordinary people with buried explosives and a wireless set tuned to London, acting in the dark, in the rain, entirely without recognition, because a voice on the radio had told them the moment had finally come. The railways of France, built across a century to move armies quickly, were unmade in a single night by the very people who lived beside them. And when the history of that longest of days is told through tanks and landing craft and beach obstacles, it is worth remembering that before a single soldier's boot touched Norman sand, the ground beneath the German army had already begun, quietly and deliberately, to give way.